My guest today is Clare Craig.
I want to talk about my new book, which I'm really excited about. The audiobook came out yesterday, and it's out in paperback and Kindle as well. And we could talk about the European Court of Human Rights case that I'm involved with at the moment. And yeah, anything else you fancy, really.
So did you read the audiobook yourself?
I did. It takes hours, yes.
So yeah, as I was just saying, I had a great time reading your book. I got the hard copy. It's hundreds of pages, and it is so well done. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, I'm not a natural writer. So I find it, really, really hard work, but I kind of thought sorry about that. I'm not a natural writer. I find it really hard work. But I just think it's so important that it's written down and referenced and recorded. And that also, in having done all of that, I think, well, there's no point if no one's going to actually read the thing. So I've tried to put into it stories as well around what was happening to people, what was happening to me as well, because I was challenged by the General Medical Council during that period, and other doctors were going through various witch hunts during that period. And I think all of that is really important. And also, of course, the censorship story, because none of it, I think, would really make sense to somebody who, has just somebody who's just lived a parallel life since 2020. It doesn't make sense unless you understand why you didn't hear the other side of the story. You have to understand that first, I think, before you can then open your mind to thinking, well, actually, there was another side to this story.
Yeah. And do you want to start by talking about the censorship?
Sure. So what it felt like at the time was mostly smearing. Just as an individual involved in it, I was being constantly smeared. One interesting aspect of it was that when I made a mistake, and, I was writing a lot, I made mistakes. When I made a mistake, it would get really widely shared. But when I was telling an inconvenient truth, it would get shut down. And so, you start to see this pattern about how different things get treated. And at the end, we had there was this sort of group of people who were telling a story about how there was a sort of military grade shutdown operation going on, and they were calling it the 77th Brigade. And sort of when people were attacking me, they'd say, "Don't worry, Claire, he's just 77th Brigade." And when I was at the sort of receiving end of all that, I wasn't really sure what to make of it. Are these people actually making up some crazy stories? Are these people bots actually and not real people at all? And then it came out in the press that this 77th Brigade was a real army unit who were charged originally with stopping kind of, terrorism and foreign interference in the UK. They were meant to be shutting down bad foreign influence, but they were shutting down me. And I am just a regular British doctor. I had nothing to gain at all and everything to lose. And these military people were coming after me and people like me. And some of that has been exposed in the mainstream press since. But frankly, I think there's a lot more exposure to come. And I think most people haven't seen the exposure there has been. Now, I think that may be a slightly different case in the United States, because you've had big high-profile court cases around censorship, and you've had even court cases that didn't necessarily go the way we would want them to go. They still existed. The evidence was all put into the public domain. And you've had kind of Congress and the Senate have their various committees reviewing these things and challenging it, because you've got the Second Amendment. And that, it's so precious. It is so precious. And I am so grateful for America that exists, because every other Western country, every other one has failed on this. And we are going in the opposite direction, and we need you guys. So thank you.
You are welcome. I agree. Second Amendment is so important. Do you think the military grade PSYOP is still going on now, or are these people just standing down and they're not doing it now?
I don't know. I don't know what they're up to. I do know that, I get the years right, around 22, 23, there were politicians in our parliament who were asking questions about this because it had come out in the mainstream press, and they were saying, look, what's going on with this 77th Brigade? Who are they accountable to? How many people are employed? What is their current remit? And they asked these questions at one of the many moments we've had recently where we've had a change in leader. And when basically the whole thing got shut down. And then when the new parliament started, it was brought up again. And they were told that it was basically never going to be revealed. It was all in secret. And that same unit moved, I'm sorry, not the same unit. There was a unit in addition to the 77th Brigade called the Counter Disinformation Unit. And it began its life under the sort of social media and culture department. But around the time when this sort of censorship story broke, it got moved to a different department. And this was a time when Russia had invaded Ukraine, and they claimed that that was their main remit at the time, was Russia invading Ukraine, and they moved the Department for Science and Technology and Innovation. Now, why do you need a counter disinformation unit in your science department? Science is about challenging and debate and humility, because science only works when we admit that we must be wrong about things so that we can learn and see what it is we're wrong about, and we can test hypotheses, and we can engage with other scientists and challenge their work and try between us to reach something closer to the truth. And so, yeah, instead we have this counter disinformation unit funded by, taxpayers like me in our science and technology department. Yeah.
So did I write this note down incorrectly from your book that the UN recruited 110,000 social media influencers? Does that sound right?
That is right. Yes. I mean, it's all of it is so upside down, isn't it? The UN, through various different means, are doing the opposite often of what they're meant to be there for. And this is absolutely the opposite of what you'd think they were doing. I mean, it was actually through UNICEF, which is meant to be, children and refugees. What's going on there that they're channeling money in that direction to shut people down? And it's really disturbing. And of course, at the UN level, the other really disturbing thing is what the WHO have been up to. Because what's troubling for me about the WHO is that they have such a powerful brand, like unbelievably trusted, including by me up until recently, right? Absolute faith that the WHO was set up with good intentions to do good. And, and they had plenty of good to be doing, so let them get on with it, right? But it's changed so much recently. And if you speak to David Bowell, who used to work for WHO, he's a doctor. He actually lives in Texas now, but he's Australian. And he will tell you how, when he worked for the WHO, they had priorities, and their priorities were, they were always a bit overstretched, and they were always trying to figure out how they could do the most good. And all of that thinking just got turned on its head because COVID became the priority over everything. So over their TB program, over their HIV program, over their malaria program, all these things that could genuinely have saved lives of, children in particular, who've got a lot of life to lose. And instead, it became all about COVID in places in the world where COVID really was not a threat of any kind. I mean, frankly, we can talk about how much of a threat it was anywhere, but nobody argues it was a threat in the places where they were removing these programs. And so, the WHO have become a real kind of wolf in sheep's clothing. And what's frightening to me is that I can lay down why I'm saying that really, really clearly, and I have in the book. But most people are so not ready to hear that. It's difficult to hear because it's such a trusted organization.
So it does sound like this whole handling of COVID was a huge wake-up call for you, where you don't believe a lot of stuff that you did maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And that's been the case with me, that it's been a huge eye-opener, this whole thing.
Absolutely. One of my children said to me the other day, Mum, can you imagine having a conversation with 2019 you? And it was slightly frightening concept, actually, because I think she would not handle the stuff I would need to say to her. And maybe I wouldn't need to say it. She can learn it slowly. But yeah, I have always been a very compliant person. I've never had a rebellious bone in my body, ever. And I have always had, a lot of faith in medicine and faith in science. And I trusted institutions fundamentally, and I trusted the media, and I trusted the political setup. And you know what? I think all of those things have potential to do good and potential to be, I think we deserve to be able to live in countries where we can trust these things. Yeah, I think it's too much to expect every individual to be constantly challenging every single thing. It's overwhelming, right? So I want to get back to a place where we can, but at the moment, these systems aren't functioning properly. They're not serving the public. And in fact, they're doing the opposite, and then it needs challenge.
Do you see any way where we can get back in the next maybe 10 years or something? We can get back to where there's organizations that we can trust?
I hate this question so much. I mean, yes, there must be a way. I don't think I've got the answers. And I think there are definitely days when I think to myself, is there any example of a failed institution historically that has got back on the rails? Or do you have to start with a parallel one? And I find that a difficult question to answer. I kind of go digging, and I'm not sure that you can reset institutional failure very easily. Now, having said that, there are some aspects of the world we live in where doing things differently is an option. So one of the key ones, one of the really easy wins, is the science and medical publishing industry. So we have an industry that is based on paper journals, with universities paying subscriptions and libraries paying subscriptions, and a few individuals as well. And it's morphed over time to be something that is a really big problem, whereby there's a lot of pharmaceutical capture, and it's been admitted for 20 years, including by editors of these journals whose job it is to ensure there isn't pharmaceutical capture. There is a lot of terrible science that gets through what they call peer review, but none of the peer reviewers pay to do it. It's very time consuming. So of course things get through if that's your method of checking. There's a reproducibility crisis where that kind of work doesn't get funded. But just in terms of publications, with the internet, we can crowdsource scientific debate, and we can just have open access to the work that's often government funded and ends up behind a paywall, and just say, look, enough. This publishing industry is not benefiting anybody. And by all means have nature and science who can become the kind of, the news aspect of what's going on in the science world, picking out the best things to share. But fundamentally, it needs to be flattened and shared and open to everybody. And I think, that's something that should have happened already, and that could yet happen without too much pain.
How about the current Wild West type of thing where people put up a paper and then on X or on your own Substack, you can dig into it and people can find out more about it that way?
So I love that in some regards. I have found it very educational. Especially when people are critiquing existing work, it's a great way of seeing where the flaws are. The problem with it is that it is frowned upon by the establishment and by people in the mainstream who use peer review as a way to gatekeep what they have to work on because it's too much volume otherwise. And I'll give you an example, actually. This is a nice example. There was a paper recently in the Lancet, and it was claiming to be a review of children and young adults in the UK, making the claim that myocarditis was more common after the virus than the vaccine, which is the claim that we know is not true. So when they published this, in fact, even before they published this, hits the mainstream, it had tons of traction. And, basically the usual story, wasn't it great that we jabbed all these kids? And it was not great that we jabbed all these kids. So that was a kind of one of those papers where you're like, okay, this has got enough red flags that it's worth spending some time on. And I spent a lot of time on it. And I found so many ways in which they were deceptive with the data. It was extraordinary. I don't think I can even remember them all. So they were doing things like, when they compared the post-infection period, they included very young children and babies, and they included people who turned 18 or even 19 by the end of the study. And those two groups have a much higher background rate of myocarditis. And they compared that, in fact, it was under 5s. That's like a massive big difference. And over a longer time frame, they compared that to the 5 to 17-year-olds after the vaccine. Well, we all know that the problem after the virus and after the vaccine, the problem is in 18 and 19-year-olds. And the numbers of 18 and 19-year-olds completely swamps the data. So, that's the kind of thing they were doing. It was all very, very wrong and easily shown to be wrong on their own terms. So I wrote a letter to the Lancet editor. Now, when you do this, you get told that there's a 250-word limit. And I had a lot of words to share with that editor. And I couldn't get it down to anything like 250. I got it down to 750 with the help of AI. Literally, I couldn't have done it without a bit of AI succinctness. And I submitted it and I wrote in the thing, I know this is too long. You need to read every word. And they did, to be fair on them. And they published it. And they published it alongside 3 other letters who also were noticing huge errors in this paper. And after that had happened, another doctor who I'm in touch with said they'd found more errors still that hadn't yet been mentioned. And what should he do about it? And I'm like, well, actually, we should be calling for a retraction of this paper. It's had massive mainstream traction. It's clearly wrong. It needs to be retracted. And the authors admitted some of these mistakes in response to my letter, but not the others. They just, ignore the others. So we wrote a retraction letter and sent it to the editor. And on Tuesday, I got a response and they said, we see that there's no reason to take this any further. The end. Like, okay. And the thing is that I'm not into retracting papers, right? I'm not sure that that's how science should work. And retracting papers has been something that's happened a lot more recently. And it can be used to attack people you just don't agree with. And it has been used. And we've seen papers retracted, which were great papers, where they should be in the published world. And then you can have a debate and you can show other things, but you don't just pull a paper if there's nothing wrong with it. If there's something really wrong with it, I think, well, maybe you should pull it, which is why I'm pursuing this one, because it's so completely wrong. But as I don't know what else you do. What else do you do? I'm just going to share the letter I wrote to the Lancet and say, look, this is what the Lancet now stands for. They don't care anymore.
Yeah. Again, the way that you pursue this stuff with so much determination, I totally love it.
Thank you, Tom. I mean, it's a really odd thing to me. It's not, as I said, I was a compliant person. I also wasn't somebody who wrote letters of complaint and who actually acted on anything. And I would say that I've learned a huge amount from the people around me who are just so much more onto, what are we going to do? Let's do something. And actually, there's a limit to what we can do, but there are things we can do. There are things we can all do, and it is worth doing them. And it honestly feels so good when you're doing something instead of just moaning about it all.
Yeah. And because the stakes are so high, right? It's not about new benches in the library or something. It's people living and dying over this, right? Yeah.
Right. And actually, beyond living and dying, if you can go beyond that as something more serious, there is a risk to our kind of the ethical framework that we are living under. And I have children and I hope to have grandchildren, and I care about the future. I mean, I also care greatly about now, but the problem we've got is this switch in how we consider the ethics at a societal level. And we've always, actually maybe not always, since the Nuremberg Code, which came out of the Nuremberg trials, that was the first time it was written down that people should be protected from medicine. The idea that you needed any kind of protection wasn't really a thing until then. And when it was written down then, it was very specifically about medical experimentation, because that was the issue at hand. And, we were taught about this at medical school. I'm not sure that people always are anymore. And then maybe it doesn't matter because things have moved on. And in 1964, there was the the World Medical Associations group. So this is nothing to do with the WHO. They are a group representing all of the different medical associations, the American Medical Association, the Australian Medical Association. So they're basically just doctors' unions. You know, they're not anything more than that. But they got together and said, look, we have a problem because the only ethical code we're working to is Nuremberg. And that feels like it was designed to stop really evil doctors doing really evil things. And actually, we need something for day-to-day use about what the ethics of medicine should be. So they got together and they wrote down how it should work. And they included the idea. Actually, they didn't include the idea until 1975 in this term. So the wording by 1975 was that individual rights needed protecting over the needs of science and society. So you've got there in that line the protection of the individual over any kind of medical research thing, like, so that's your Nuremberg bit, and society. Now, the and society bit is a public health line. That's what that means. And they knew there was a risk to the individual from, you know, that kind of public health greater good ideology. And so they said, no, the individual must be protected. And they were right to say that, because if you live in a society where every individual is protected, then you live in a society that's protected. You know, that's how it works. It flows from that idea. If you live in a society where the needs of the greater good are put above the needs of the individual, then in that very term, greater good, you have inherent sacrifice. That's inherent in that idea. And you've moved to a utilitarian ethical system. And we know about utilitarian ethical systems because we've seen it play out politically in, you know, communist countries and in fascist countries. And it's not a good thing. And it is a thing we need to be protected from. Now, kind of concerningly, that Declaration of Helsinki has continued to evolve. And over time, the word science and society got kind of changed. So there's still this idea, they're still clear that the individual needs protection, because that's true. But now it's from the sort of needs of research. They dropped the society bit and they've added in a line about this is true even in emergencies. It sounds quite a good line. But the thing is that if you don't say that, it means this is true. All of the time and forever, this is true. If you add in it's true even in emergencies, then someone can come along and say, yeah, but they didn't think about this emergency, did they? And then you actually let in a chink of light. And so, you know, if you watch how the wording has changed for that among the doctors, you can see how the thinking of the medical profession has drifted. Not like they are not utilitarian in that Declaration of Helsinki yet, but it's headed in that direction. It's sort of pointed slightly more towards it. And the thing is that public health as a kind of as a idea, as a sort of what's the term? Public health as a sort of body of knowledge, that sort of, and their ethos is a utilitarian one, and it always has been, and this is not the only time when that's a problem. And one of the problems we have in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, public health has always been a specialty that has not been well rewarded. And so doctors tended not to want to go into it. So a lot of the day-to-day work before 2020 was things like managing kind of environmental health, and vaccines were a huge part of it, of their sort of day-to-day. And they would, you know, trace sort of food poisoning episodes, that kind of thing. And so what had happened over time is that doctors chose not to do it and other people were stepping in. So a lot of our public health officials, not at the top, but at lower rungs, are not qualified doctors. And that means they've not had any ethical training along these lines at all. And so, you know, that I think is an enormous problem if you don't have that. I mean, within the medical profession more broadly, we've also got a huge problem here of importing doctors who haven't had that same ethical training. And if you're importing doctors from other cultures where it might be more utilitarian, then I think that needs to be addressed. You can't just import doctors without addressing our ethical framework and we know what it means to be as part of this society that we live in.
Okay, let's switch gears here and talk about some of the details in your book. There's a lot of interesting stuff about history. You want to talk at all about the story of smallpox and how the real story or the smallpox vaccine is not the story that I heard my entire life?
Yeah, sure. So when I was writing it, one of the challenges I had was that word vaccine, because that's such a powerful word. It's such a powerful word. And, we are taught it's a modern medical miracle. We are taught that they work, obviously, and we are taught that they're completely safe because you wouldn't give, something unsafe to healthy children, would you? And so that word encompasses safe and effective. You don't need the safe and effective mantra the way we had it, because that word alone means that to people. And so when I was writing it, at one point, I was like, I can't use this word. I've got to try and write this book without using this word. And I was going to use spiked and unspiked and spiking. And it completely was unreadable. So I didn't do that. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to address it in a different way. So I start the book by taking people back in time, because I think that's quite a useful way of stripping out the emotion and just saying, okay, look, imagine you're back in, 1700s with Edward Jenner, and what was going on. And what was going on was that the children were dying a lot. It must have been scary. They were dying a lot. They were dying of smallpox a lot, and in sort of epidemic waves. And people wanted to do anything they could to protect their children. And so they did this thing called variolation, which is a disgusting thing to do. Really, they took pus from smallpox, pustules on a sick child, and they would put it onto, like a bit of material or some cloth, some dirty cloth or something, and put it into the arm of a healthy child. And in so doing, they were spreading smallpox, and children were dying more of smallpox. And the WHO are quite clear in their report on the eradication of smallpox that it was variolation that was causing the epidemic outbreaks up until the 70s. It was still going on in India and Africa in pockets. So, that the variolation very much was a big problem causing smallpox. So if you've got children dying of variolation, you don't just need rescuing from smallpox anymore. You also need rescuing from variolation. And Edward Jenner wrote a thesis, which is actually quite short, and it's available online, and you can read it cover to cover. And he does a few sort of little stories about people he's met and what happened to them, and then tells his story about his vaccine. Now, his story about his vaccine says, well, there are various different poxes. And I think I've discovered the pox that can protect you from smallpox. And the pox, he called it horse grease cowpox, because what he meant by that was that regular cowpox that a milkmaid would catch when milking cow wouldn't do it. You needed a special kind of cowpox where the men had been clearing out the hooves of the horses, this sort of pussy hoof, and then the men shared the milking, which was unusual. And that the cows then got this horse grease cowpox, and then the milkmaid caught that, and then she was protected. So it was quite a convoluted theory, really. And it wasn't the theory that we were taught, in school and beyond, around cowpox protects you from smallpox. And when he published it, he was kind of ridiculed about it, not least because his sales pitch was, let's cut out the middleman and just inject horse pus into healthy children. But somebody political spotted an opportunity, and they said, well, let's run with this story, and we can use this vaccine idea to at least stop the variolation. I mean, I don't know if that was their actual motivation. I do know that he was rewarded with a lot of money and medals, and then kept quiet about his actual theory. And then from then on, they were vaccinating. Now, the vaccines in those days were not what they are today. This was a time when there was no refrigeration. There were no laboratories, there were no microscopes. So what the first vaccines was children who had his horse grease cowpox, whatever kind of pustule, and they were just doing the same as variolation. They were taking pus from a pussy child and putting it onto a thread or a bit of cloth and sticking it into the arm of a healthy child. So one description was of a doctor who had a vial in his jacket pocket of this pussy mark. And then he would sew the thread deep into the fat of the arm. It had to go really deep, he thought, and then leave this pussy thread in their arm. Now, obviously, these children then got TB and they got syphilis and they got bacterial infections and some of them died. And there was a lot of pushback because parents and regular people could see the harm that was being caused. But even then, even when there was no way this could work, and there was obvious ways in which it was causing harm, and there was political debate, there were people who were actually fighting against it, there was still this deeply disturbing thing going on where the majority wanted this to work so much that they kind of made it into a belief system that you couldn't question. And they attacked those that were dissenting. And, that whole story of that sort of attitude towards vaccines is very, very old. And that is not the story that I learned at school about where vaccines came from. And they would make these vaccines by getting a calf and sticking some cowpox or the right kind of cowpox pus into it, and its belly would get swollen up with fluids from this infection, and they would they sort of put this weird cement over their bellies. I mean, I don't know exactly what the recipe was, but you can read the descriptions, and it's all a bit grim. And then they would tap off this fluid from the cow, stick it into glass vials, sell it to doctors who would keep it warm in their pocket on their rounds, and that's what a vaccine was. And if you read the WHO report from the 70s of the eradication of smallpox, they're very, very clear in that report on two things. One, intramuscular injection didn't work. It had to be on the very surface of the skin. And they did this thing where it was just very superficial before it would work. And they also said that liquid didn't work. It had to be freeze-dried. So, the kind of things that people were saying on the ground in the 70s are all things that have been forgotten. So if you remember, we had the monkeypox scare. And with monkeypox, we were told that men who had sex with men should get the smallpox vaccine to protect them. You remember that? And that was an IM injection of a liquid that you couldn't possibly have tested against either smallpox or monkeypox, because how would you do the data on that?
Do you think there was some sort of hope somewhere that the monkeypox thing would explode into lockdowns and everything else?
You know what? I do, Tom. I do. I mean, when I was just watching that happen at that time, it was shortly after Bill Gates had done his "just you wait till next time" grin in that interview. And the Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's the Director General of the WHO, he had overridden his emergency committee. I can't remember their full title, but they're charged with making these kind of decisions. And they had voted 9-6 against calling monkeypox a public health emergency of international concern, which is pronounced fake, PHEIC, fake. And so they decided not to call it that, which is the step before a pandemic. And he said he had to overrule them because 6-9 is very close. It needed a tie break. And the thing is, the WHO constitution was written by people who, well, I mean, I don't know what their intention was. I don't even know who they were. But I think it may have been that their intentions were good and that they did not think about an organization such as the WHO being used in a negative manner as a kind of, power grab. So the constitution of the WHO is really, really problematic. And it gives the Director General kind of dictatorship type powers.
Do you want to talk at all about the narrative that we've been told about the Spanish flu in 1918 and what the reality was?
Yeah, I love that topic. So I can't tell you everything of the reality, but I can tell you lots of things about it that were really, really wrong. So the big one is the number of people who died. Right? This is something that everybody quotes all of the time. And what fascinates me is how that number has changed over time. So it keeps changing. It keeps getting bigger. You can sort of literally track its progress over the last, 100 years as it's grown. And the Wellcome Trust claim it's 100 million lives that were lost. And the math just doesn't work. It just very simply doesn't work. So everybody agrees there were 3 waves. They agree about 10% were affected in each wave. So that gives you the number of potential infections. And if it was 100 million deaths, it would be a 17% death rate or something huge. You know, it just completely doesn't add up. And so you only have to do basic maths to see it is wrong, completely wrong. So that sort of made me interested in going back right to the earliest number I could find, which was written in the 1920s, when somebody had said, right, let's figure out how bad this was. You know, they're sort of coming out the other end of it. And they had great data on certain places in Europe and the USA. And there were some big gaps in their data set for places like China and Japan and, you know, all of Africa and Asia, basically. So they extrapolated from their data, but they also added in a multiplier. They said, well, you know, we've got great healthcare in the US, so let's assume that we survived this more than they did everywhere else. So they did a multiplier for the rest of the world. And having done that and modeled the number, they came up with 20 million deaths. So that's a big difference from 100 million. But I think it was also wrong, because when you look into what happened in terms of the pathology, it's not right. There's 2 pathologies going on. So you've got influenza pathology where people have a viral infection and they subsequently get a pneumonia, and then they get a bacterial infection, often on that pneumonia. They don't have to have that in addition, but that's often what happens, and they die. The people that die in that way are old and frail. Sorry. So that's a kind of normal influenza death. And this particular virus, this H1N1 virus from 1918, still around. It still comes back every single winter. And in some winters, it's the dominant influenza virus. It's never done anything more than that since or before. And so then you've got this other pathology. So the other pathology was young people. They died with massive fevers. They had a weird violet rash on their face called a heliotrope rash. Their lungs were full of blood and wet and heavy. They died very suddenly. Now, that pathology is not influenza. It's something else. And so when you sort of look at it just as a pathologist, you say, well, what kinds of things could cause that? Well, some people have proposed it was phosgene gas from the trenches. And phosgene gas is colorless and odorless and deadly. And when people die, they die in that manner. It was being produced in factories, you know, around Europe. And it had this odd smell of wet hay, the people who were affected. And some people had used that description about these people dying of flu as well. So that's interesting. I don't get it, though. I don't see how that could happen. Like, how can you affect that large a part of the world? And, you know, it was everywhere. Like Pacific Islands, like Samoa had it. You know, it was everywhere. I don't see how you can get gas from the trenches and the factories to Samoa. So I don't think that's the answer. Another answer, which I find absolutely fascinating and quite compelling, is that there was a wonder drug at the time. So there was aspirin has been around since sort of medieval times. It's made from willow bark. So it's been used for fevers for forever. But it was being manufactured by Bayer in Germany in the turn of the century. And when war was declared, their patent became obsolete. And so loads of US and UK companies took on aspirin as their new product and marketed it in a big way. So when the influenza fear and hysteria began, these companies were pushing their product as the solution. And there was a lack of knowledge about how toxic aspirin can be. And there were recommendations to take a dosage that we know is fatal. And when aspirin kills, it kills in that manner with the massive fevers and the hemorrhagic lungs and the sudden death. And so I think aspirin is a very likely candidate for what happened there. And I find that fascinating, because then you've got this other aspect of that story, which is, well, why would people so frightened that they were shoving aspirin into young, healthy people in that manner? And if you look at the newspapers around that time, which you can get now, it's brilliant. All these things are being digitalized. You can read about the attitude towards influenza among Victorians. Now, going back to Victorian times again, as I was saying before, they died a lot. And so they were absolute hypochondriacs. Like, it was astonishing. They were talking about health all the time. And they were constantly writing advice about what to do with this and that. And the advice tended to be, at the first sign of anything, jump into bed and call the doctor. So, it wasn't very good advice if the doctor is then giving you aspirin. And if people are then the aspirin's making you feverish, and then you're like, oh shit, this is a really bad one, we better give them more aspirin. And then they do die. And so then when the next person who gets a fever, they're that much more scared, aren't they? And so you can see how these hysterias can take off. In fact, there was one newspaper article thinking about Samoa, where they were reporting just before Samoa got their wave about how the third wave was going to be the most deadly one. You're like, oh, that's so familiar. That's so familiar. This is before the third wave had happened. They were reporting it was going to be even more deadly this time. Yeah.
So, roughly what sort of dosage of aspirin were they taking? Like, how many times what people are taking today? I'm curious.
Oh gosh, I've always been terrible at dosages. That's why I went into pathology. I think it was 3 grams, but it could have been 3 milligrams. But it was 3 was the recommendation. And yeah, so that it's a really huge amount. I mean, there was one woman who described her husband dying. It was tragic, and how they were giving him half handfuls as often as they could of aspirin. So, it was a completely different league to what people are at risk of. But as I said, there wasn't this understanding of drug safety. And, that has been learned slowly and the hard way. And so, aspirin can actually be very dangerous in children. So under 12s should never have aspirin at all. And that lesson was learned, a lot later on. And so I think when we're looking back historically, we shouldn't look back and assume things we know today were known. And we shouldn't even assume that the words they're using are used in the same way that we use them today. And so, just because they called something an influenza wave doesn't mean it was what we would call something an influenza wave today.
One thing you mentioned is it tends to be there's waves of respiratory viruses, and around 8% of people, when you reach that's the end of the wave, or that helps to end it. Does that sound right?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. So the lie that we were told was that we were facing this tsunami of infection, that 85% of people would be infected in the first wave. That is what put us into lockdown and began this whole thing off, started this whole thing off. And so this was going to be the most enormous, unbelievable wave of infection affecting almost everybody. And it would peak in July of 2020. That was the prediction. And squashing the sombrero would therefore push that peak out from July 2020 to far later. And we could just manage the healthcare system. That was what was told at the beginning. Now, of course, that's nothing like what happened, because it rose in a way that looks frightening, because you have this doubling thing going on at the beginning of any kind of wave. And doubling is frightening if you pretend that it can go on indefinitely. But it peaked and fell everywhere at about the same time. And it peaked and fell everywhere at about the same time because there is an underlying predictable pattern of waves of respiratory viral infection, which do peak in spring. When they occur in spring, they don't always occur in spring with every virus, but when they occur, they peak. And we have peak deaths in the UK on around the 10th of April. It was the 11th of April in 2021 in Eastern Europe when we didn't see a peak. And you get a peak every early January in deaths. And you get a peak at the end of every October in deaths. And you sometimes even get some in the summer. Not every summer, but you sometimes get it in the summer. And when you look at all the data in that big picture way, so most of the data is for influenza, but that's okay, because we actually have quite a lot of data on coronaviruses now too, and they seem to be exactly the same. Then you realize that there was never a risk of this tsunami. Now, what's really frightening to me is that that was absolutely clear at the end of that first wave. It was clear that the hypothesis was wrong and it needed to be changed. And, it was never redressed. They kept pretending everybody was susceptible. They kept pretending it was because people were locked in their homes, that they weren't breathing contaminated air. And the thing about contaminated air is that, those videos people have shared about when people have a surgical mask on and you see the steam coming out the sides when they vaped or when they're in the cold air or something like that. And that's aerosols. Like when you're in the cold and you're breathing, you see those aerosols. And they are in warm air because we breathe out warm air. So when they come out, they drift upwards. And when things drift upwards, they can stay buoyant for a long, long time. So if you think about seeds, that when you sometimes see them drifting through the spring air and when they catch the sunlight and they just seem to be going on and on and up and up and up and away. It's like that. These aerosols go up and away like a seed. They're way, way, way smaller than a seed. And so when you're at home at night and you're sick and you're producing virus, that virus enters the air. And, if your window's open, it will go out the window. And when it gets outside, there is no UV light in the night time. So they will continue to spread. And people have tracked that spread. And they've made predictions based on it that were correct. Around, for example, there was this hexagon-shaped block of flats in Hong Kong early on. And they said, well, somebody was infected down there. And we predict from the wind currents that these people up here are going to get sick. And they did get sick. And they hadn't met each other. But they got sick because aerosols spread in the air. And because they spread in the air, it's essentially everywhere very, very quickly. And we saw that with every variant, as soon as they kind of say, well, we've declared some new mutation, it's everywhere very, very quickly because, air moves a lot. And you can't avoid it. Now that once you realize that actually we are being exposed to stuff all the time and we were exposed to all of these variants, then you stop and say, well, hang on a second, then how come I'm well? You're like, well, you're well for a number of reasons. Reason number one is you've got a mucus lining in your respiratory tract, which is keeping the viruses from getting into your cells, which is brilliant, way better than any mask. And, the viruses can only get through that mucus barrier when something goes wrong that we don't understand. Probably hijack it. There's probably like piggyback on bacteria, which can cut through mucus. And that might be why only a proportion are infected. So, most of the time your mucus is doing its job. You don't need to think about it. It's done. And then besides that, if a virus does manage to get in, we have immune systems that are protecting us all of the time from all sorts of rubbish that we inhale. And they're great. And you can put your faith in them. They're good. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And so, the fact is that the vast majority of us, the vast majority of the time, are bystanders, and we don't have to fret about it. It's only ever this fraction. And, you started this at the beginning saying this 8% figure. So that 8% figure comes from the enormous amount of money our government spent on contact tracing. And it was a waste of money, except that they did produce good data, but then they ignored it. And this data showed that when you had a household and COVID, if somebody had COVID within that household, as long as you ignored anyone that caught it at the same time as that person, you just looked at, well, what's the sort of second generation of COVID within the household? And you could get a percentage of people who got sick subsequently. And that percentage changed over the course of the wave. It was higher at the beginning and it was lower at the end every single time, which meant every single time they could say, oh, this one's more transmissible. You're like, well, yeah, but it's done that every single time. And when you average it over the course of the wave, it was 8.5% if you measured it with lateral flow tests. And it was, a little bit higher, around 10% when you measured it with PCR. It was a little bit higher for Omicron. But prior to Omicron, it was constant. It stayed the same after the vaccines. And that means the vaccines completely failed to protect anybody from infection. We also had a measure of antibodies. So blood donors had their blood tested for antibodies to see who'd been infected. And so you could trace the kind of population level progress through each wave. And the antibody percentage was a bit lower, it's about 6% got antibodies after each wave. And it continued to be about 6% thereafter after the vaccines. So it made no impact on who developed antibodies either. So, the vaccines did not stop infection. And I made the argument in the book that they also did not prevent severe disease and they did not prevent death. They didn't work on any measure. The only thing I will concede is that you can make a case that in 2021 there was a reduction in mortality if you look at it in one particular way, but that was like overwhelmed by excess mortality among the vaccinated in 2022. So, if you postpone something by a few months, was it all worth it for that? No.
You do mention that COVID can travel long distances through the air. I'm wondering, how long is that distance? Like, could you be on an island tens of miles away? Can it go that far, or 100 yards?
So there was outbreaks on the Antarctic research base where people had isolated at home and then they'd flown to South Africa and they'd isolated in a hotel and then they'd gone to the research base and then, a long time later they'd get an outbreak. There was an outbreak on an Argentinian fishing vessel, which was at sea for 35 days. And then they had an outbreak. Yeah, it can spread everywhere. In fact, there's research where people have tried to collect bacteria and viruses from the air in random places. So like at the top of the mountains of Spain or over the oceans. And they collect them from the air. So, the air is full of all sorts of things that we are protected from, pretty much.
Yeah, so all that masking, all that 6-foot distancing, all that stuff, the vaccines, et cetera, none of it really helped, did it? There was no flattening of the curve, no flattening.
No, and the thing is that in some ways, if it would be nice to be able to write a book that said, what happened here was unethical. And it was unethical despite the fact these things worked. I'd like to write that book because I think it's a very, very important lesson to say, even when things work, you mustn't be unethical. But I can't write that book because that's not what the evidence shows. So the evidence shows not only was it unethical, but even on purely utilitarian scientific terms, it didn't work.
So what do you think happened to influenza? We see these graphs saying it just went away for a couple of years. What happened?
Yeah, I know. I mean, this is really tricky. And I don't pretend to know the answer. I can tell you this. It completely disappeared in a way that was sort of unbelievable. It subsequently came back. So in 2022, when things started to become a little bit more normal, the WHO influenza reporting would show these M-shaped waves in a place where you'd have an influenza spike and then this big bite taken out of it by a COVID spike and then an influenza spike again, or the other way around, COVID, then influenza, then COVID within one winter season, which makes it look like they're on a reciprocal relationship. Now, some of the people I'm in touch with would say that's clearly something weird going on with the testing, like people are switching the tests in an hour, and that's why you're getting that image. Now, I don't buy that, because I think that there are enough labs doing enough testing using independent testing materials for that to be shown up. You should see that because there's, it should be being done independently. Now, I don't know actually, in reality, how many labs all use the same kind of PCR sent from China in order to build their tests. Because if that's happening too much, you could get people just, messing around with the results and we would be blind to it because we're not doing the checks that are required. But I think the checks are being done. I think there are enough people who do check things independently. I fear I could be proved wrong.
Another thing that I was looking at where they had those dashboards. I don't know how to pronounce it, worldometer dashboards. It's all everywhere and it's updated every day. And I was thinking, wow, all the hospitals are reporting this in real time. It's real data, but that was modeled data, right? Not real data. Right.
It was not real. It was a really odd situation where the UK actually has great health data. We've got one system which makes it way easier than in the US. We have a lot of money spent into collecting it, partly so the government can sell it on to pharma. That's the kind of money stream that they use. And so, we were really well ahead of the game. And I've worked in that area, and I know for certain how hard it is to start collecting new data on a new topic, and how complex it is to get every reporting place to report in a uniform way to a central place. It's not easy to do. And yet we were being told that this was happening globally. Every corner of the world was successfully finding out every single case and every single death. And the tell was that these tickets would be going up every 15 minutes. as if the reporting could be done like that. And somebody dug into it at Panda, which is the Pandata kind of group, that international group of sort of skeptics. And they found this GitHub resource where the guy who was running and deeply involved with these dashboards had got his model that he was using to produce these numbers. And then you had this perverse situation where the numbers from this model were becoming the official number. And then the sort of politicians were referencing this number, and it sort of becomes real. What do? You can't have two parallel systems running. So it was all a bit back to front, I think. It wasn't all coming from source by any means, and certainly not in countries that literally do not have the infrastructure to do this kind of thing.
Okay, we're coming up to our end of our hour already here. Any other points you want to make before we finish this one up?
Well, yeah, I could just mention that I'm involved in this European human rights case that I mentioned at the beginning. So there's a Finnish man called Mika who, at the age of 41, was unvaccinated and hadn't paid for his €200 PCR test. And on the 10th of December, he entered a chain cafe and ordered a coffee and a croissant, and was denied them. It's worked its way through the Finnish courts, again, through all the different layers. And his case is now going to be heard at the European Court of Human Rights. And I'm doing a witness statement for him. And I do think it is a really important case. And I think the fundamental point is all of this stuff around what kind of society are we? What are the medical ethics? Are we going to stay in a system that protects the individual? Because as a 41-year-old man, healthy man, he was not at risk from COVID. And his choice to not be vaccinated with a vaccine that had demonstrated safety issues by the 10th of December 2021, and actually the people who were charged with the rollout of it had admitted that it couldn't work and that it didn't work. And yet he was being forced to have this medical procedure that late on in the day. So, I think it is an important case. And I just really hope that the judge realizes the importance of it and draws a line around why we have these declarations of human rights and how they can't just be thrown in the bin when it's politically convenient.
All right. On that note, I will let you go. I do have your X handle in my show description, and also a link to the Amazon copy of your book, Spiked, A Shot in the Dark. So thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Tom.
Talk to you next time. Bye.